President Trump expressing all sorts of concerns for weeks, really months, on vote by mail. We will dive in to this topic of conversation and all that you really need to know about the facts of vote by mail. And here's one reality to keep in mind. Colorado, where I'm broadcasting from, was the third state to implement a vote by mail system statewide. That was after about a decade of getting to that point. It wasn't something that happened in a matter of months like people trying to push vote by mail in new states are moving with. It took time, and Colorado was the third state. So while Colorado is a great example of an effective use of a vote by mail system, putting it into place well, overall, I would say, that doesn't mean that other states can jump right into it, which is why I wanted to talk with a couple leading experts here in Colorado about vote by mail. Both of them were county clerks when this system went into effect, and shortly thereafter, one of these gentlemen was elected Secretary of State of Colorado. I am pleased today to be joined by former Colorado Secretary of State and former El Paso County, Colorado Clerk and Recorder Wayne Williams, and former Clerk and Recorder for Arapahoe County, Matt Crane, both joining us. And now Matt is an elections consultant. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show. It's good to have you both.
Thanks, Jimmy. It's good to be here.
Jimmy, it's good to be with you again.
So I want to start today by playing a montage that CNN had put together of President Donald Trump. This is cut 7 of President Donald Trump over the last number of months criticizing vote by mail and expressing concerns about this system, just to kind of help tee things up today.
By mail is wrought with fraud and abuse, and people don't get their ballots. When you do all mail-in voting ballots, you're asking for fraud. People steal them out of mailboxes. People print them, and then they sign them, and they give them in. These mail-in ballots where they send millions of them all over the country, it's going to be a rigged election.
So, a rigged election. President Trump expressing concern about vote by mail. Secretary of State Wayne Williams, I want to start with you. We'll dive into the topic of some of these criticisms of the vote by mail system or some concerns. But last time we had you on back during the spring, we talked a bit about how the system in Colorado developed over time, and that rushing it could be a problem and certainly a challenge for a heck of a lot of states that, amidst coronavirus, are trying to implement vote by mail systems. So can you just give us a little bit of the history of how Colorado got this system started?
So Colorado had no excuse absentee voting for a number of years, and then we moved to you could become a permanent mail-in voter. We had originally about 20% of the people who chose to do that. By 2013, that had become 70% of the people who chose to be a permanent mail-in voter. And at that point, the state then made the decision through legislation to mail ballots to all Coloradans who were active registered voters. Over the next 5 years, we then did a number of tweaks and improvements to that law, which made it so that our system worked very well here in Colorado. There's a number of things we do. We have, first, an accurate voting list. So we check citizenship. We check with the post office to make sure someone's there. We also do some incredibly important things, like making sure that people are still alive. So we do all of those steps on a daily basis. We get reports from various government agencies. We know who becomes incarcerated and becomes ineligible to vote for that reason, which is conviction of a felony in Colorado. So all of those steps are in place. Then we mail out ballots. We've made it easy for people to return. We have 24/7 drop boxes that are under video surveillance. And then they're collected by a bipartisan team of judges, meaning that we always have both a Democrat and a Republican. That is then taken to a counting room where you have bipartisan judges and video surveillance. We also check the signatures. And we make sure that signature matches so we know it actually is that person. We then, once we tabulate it, have a risk limiting audit to make sure that all of those processes were done properly and the ballots were counted accurately. Here's the significant difference between Colorado and what has been proposed in legislation that passed the House. In legislation that passed the House, it strikes down all state requirements for signature verification or identification and simply says as long as someone signs the ballot envelope and alleges that it is them, that you have to count it. That is a system ripe with fraud. In Colorado, we checked to make sure it actually was that person, but the legislation passed by the Democrats in the House says that you can simply sign it, you must accept that signature, and so if you go to the post office and find a dozen ballots that are discarded, you could vote those.
Yeah.
And it's important to talk about what system you're talking about when you talk about vote by mail.
Right.
If you talk about, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so I just want to jump in there real quick, and we'll get to that for sure. But what you're talking about, just to make it clear for folks, is a Democratic proposal that has been presented in the House of Representatives. When the Democrats talk about advancing vote by mail and helping to fund a system, this is what they're trying to do, is to fund systems that do not have these signature verification processes in place that Colorado has had very successfully. And I want to get Matt Crane in on this point, because one of the things that's so striking about what Wayne Williams was just describing, again, the former Secretary of State, and Matt, you as a clerk and recorder really had a lot of experience working very closely in implementing these systems. He's explaining something that is very elaborate, very detailed, a lot of different components going on in a vote-by-mail system in Colorado that have made it work, which makes one worry a bit about implementing this kind of system in other states that haven't tried it before.
I think that's right. It is a very complicated system, and as Wayne said, it took us over 20 years to get to this point. I think that the advantage that other states have now is that they can learn from the examples of Colorado and Oregon and Washington about what to do right and the things that they should avoid doing, and how to do it smart, how to do it in the smartest possible way. The concern now, we saw a lot of this movement happen because of COVID, but the concern is taking this process and trying to truncate it into 180 days or 6 months to be able to go from a no excuse absentee state where your absentee ballot numbers are 15% or less of your voting population, and try to get up to a point to where, you're between 70 and 90%. That's a huge lift. And so I think that's where you see, I know Wayne's been helping other states. I've been helping other states do everything we can to prepare for this, but it is tough, and it's going to be a bumpy road for some states.
I want to play a clip of a Democratic critic of President Trump from Colorado in cut 8. The current Secretary of State of Colorado, Jenna Griswold, was on, and she accused President Trump of, actually cut 9, of voter suppression over some of his critiques about vote by mail. Take a listen to this for those of the audience, and I'll sum it up for our guests.
So what do you do then if the USPS does not get the funding, right? If he blocks that funding, then what do you do? I mean, does that then put the sanctity of the election in question if it doesn't get that funding?
Well, Colorado's election model has built-in contingencies. So, for example, we send out ballots 3 weeks before the election day, and there's hundreds of mail ballot drop boxes across the state. And the majority of Coloradans, about 75%, actually take their mail ballot to a drop box. So one of the things that I've been doing is increasing the number of drop boxes. We added 91 last year, and then I announced funding for an additional 100 this year. So those are some of the measures that states can do. But I will tell you, the president is going to all lengths to try to suppress the vote. The RNC is suing in Pennsylvania about drop boxes. It doesn't matter what you do. They are coming with a lawsuit and lies to try to suppress turnout in November.
So essentially, what the current Secretary of State, Jenna Griswold, is saying is that right now Republicans are trying to spew lies and bring about lawsuits in order to suppress the vote, engage in voter suppression. She particularly highlights how Colorado has a system of drop boxes in this state, which is how I vote. I've never voted by mail where I've actually put the stamp on a envelope and then on the ballot envelope and then mailed it in. Matt Crane, former Arapahoe County, Colorado clerk and recorder. I've always put it at one of these drop boxes, but the question posed was about U.S. Postal Service funding, and if the post office doesn't get this funding, then it's going to have all of these snags of the Postal Service. So two-part question for you, Matt Crane. Number one is, if you could talk a little bit about the Postal Service funding question, particularly given the point about drop boxes that have been effectively used in Colorado with, for example, camera security provided, but also this notion of expressing concerns about voter fraud and issues that can come about from this system that might be put into place, certainly the Democrats are advocating, and the idea that that equates to voter suppression.
Sure. So your first question about the post office. Look, I think you can look at things. There's a lot of information out lately about the post office, about, how over the last 15 years, I think there was a journal article out this morning, how they've lost $80 billion. In last quarter, they lost $2.2 billion. So, I think that there's a fair argument to be had about the efficiency of the post office. I wish the president would have waited until after the election to do this, because if for no other reason, the optics of this don't look good. And so, I wish he would have waited on that particular point. But I do think, in terms of the Postal Service and being a good partner for the election process, we found here in Colorado that they've been a tremendous partner. So again, I think the timing of this, I wish he would have waited until after the election. In terms of the broad claims about fraud and mail ballot, I think that, when you look at it, there's no perfect system. But for me, when I look at it, mail ballot is more secure than in-person voting. For me, it's much tougher to, I think on the whole, it's much tougher to try to forge a signature than it is to create a fake utility bill, right? And let's not pretend that there haven't been lots of issues with fraud or perceived fraud with in-person voting going back forever. But we do know that the mail ballot process, especially the process that we've set up in Colorado, has been really a secure process. In terms of the ballot drop boxes, that's one of the things I'm proud of here in Arapahoe County. And thank you to Wayne, who really helped encourage counties when he was secretary to expand the number of drop boxes that they had. He provided funding for counties to be able to do that. It was an important step. And, a drop box is the safest, most secure way for you to cast your mail ballot. There's no question about that. So I think, the questions about fraud, especially for the states that have been doing this, are overstated. Do we need to make sure that the states that are trying to increase absentee voting for this election, that are somewhat newbies to this process, do we need to make sure, as we've said, that they're checking the right boxes and doing everything they can? Yes, we do. If they don't, does that open up to avenues for potential fraud? Yes, it does. But I think that there's a lot of organizations out there right now with current and former election officials involved that are working with these states to try to help them to make sure they're dotting the I's and crossing the T's. So I'm hopeful that things will be successful. But in terms of the drop boxes and fraud, we sweep those every day with bipartisan election judges. As Wayne said, there's, here in Colorado, we have 24/7 video surveillance on those cameras.
Right.
So it really is a very safe and secure process to cast your ballot.
I completely agree with you, Matt Crane, on all those points. Especially, I was a skeptic in the beginning when we made the switch. I was only a few election cycles in as a voter, and when vote by mail was put into place, but I was concerned in the beginning, but then with all the safeguards that were put into place, I felt a lot more confident. And now I do believe that this is a very good system. But again, Wayne Williams, former Colorado Secretary of State, to the points we were discussing before, Colorado took years to get to this point. All of the things that you're both talking about in terms of the different mechanisms in place to ensure election integrity took time. When we're talking about all these drop boxes that have to be set up along with the video cameras, that's a whole slew of different things. that have to be put into place and take time. It's not like you can just do it overnight.
Right. And so you really have to look at when someone says mail ballots are perfectly safe or mail ballots are ripe for fraud, it depends on which system you're talking about. The Colorado system that has, as Matt explained, drop boxes under video surveillance with bipartisan teams of judges picking up the ballots, that checks the signatures, that's a safe system, and it works. And it's worked in a number of elections, but it's been built over time. As part of that, we make sure that we have a database that makes sure no one votes more than once in Colorado. That's not to say that a system that strips away those protections, like was passed by the Democrats in the House, is a safe system. That is a system ripe for fraud. And so because it strips away signature verification, it simply says, as long as someone signs the ballot, you have to accept it. Well, that's an absurd system. And so it all depends what you're attacking. And one of the downsides with political sound bites, I know this shocks you to hear, Jimmy, is that sometimes those sound bites don't address the nuances.
Whoa. No. Say it ain't so. I've been you two have been the ones who've run for office. Actually, I did run for a House vacancy position at one point, but that aside, I mean, I'm shocked. Wayne Williams, I'm floored about this.
Well,
you don't capture nuances sometimes in political statements?
Nope. You sometimes miss those. And so when the president talks about mail ballots being ripe for fraud, I think he's referring to the House bill that strips away signature verification.
Yeah.
When my successor here in Colorado talks about the system is secure, she's absolutely talking about the Colorado system that all of us have worked to ensure. In fact, there was just a press release not too long ago from the Colorado Secretary of State outlining those precautions. Mm-hmm. And actually, she has taken the expansion of voter drop boxes that I began and continued to that work. And so we do want people to vote. We want them to be able to vote securely. We want their ballot counted. And we don't want the ballot diluted by someone who doesn't have the legal ability to vote or who forged a signature. And so in Colorado, we have those protections. Our system does work. And so in some sense, you have the two of them talking about two completely different systems. And sometimes people forget those differences and get sloppy in the way they say things. Certainly that can happen when you're a national figure and you might not recognize the differences between a system like Colorado and a system that has a number of problems like proposed in the House legislation.